morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. This is episode 52 of the Blowback Roundtable. We have our regulars, Carlo and Ben, and special guest Ian Kummer coming live from a suburb in Moscow. Thank you very much, Ian. Today we were going to discuss Putin's big interview with Tucker Carlson. It almost has 200 million views since the interview took place. What was it? Thursday at 6 p.m. Well, it was uploaded Thursday 6 p.m.
Eastern Standard Time.
Yeah. So I think we all have thoughts to share, but we're gonna flip a coin to see who wants to start with their thoughts.
I think Moscow should be the authority.
Okay.
What do you guys think? By the way, in Yekaterinburg, I saw like a poster outside of a cinema. Like there's a Marvel movie, and the other one was Tucker and Putin interview. So obviously, people in Russia can see it at the theater.
It's about the same length as a feature-length film. It's about 2 hours. So that makes sense.
So what did you think, Ian?
Well, it was even just like, and this became like meme material across the internet.
Yes.
It caught everybody surprised and that's the thing with Putin's interviews. You know, you can never really predict exactly how they're going to go. I mean, he is consistent, but they're also not always predictable. So I don't think really anybody, at least Western people like myself, were expecting a 30-minute 1,000-year history lesson about Rus. And you know, people debate was that a smart play to spend so much on-screen time with that. It's debatable. I will say it's, you know, as far as a history lesson, so I do have some teaching certificates in the Army and in the National Rifle Association, actually, just for teaching classes. And so one thing I learned is that only about 40 to 60% of what you say to a person will be mentally retained. So as far as no one's going to remember all these dates. He spit out all these facts. He spit out, but I think the overall message resonated with pretty much everybody that this is a very long history. You have one people, and this idea that Ukrainians and Russians are completely separate with different origins, separate, you know, parallel, not the same origins, is just not a true statement. I think that's particularly because Tucker Carlson is an American, so the primary audience is an American audience. Of course, there's other audiences, but it's primarily the American audience. And for us, we have, for one, since the Cold War began, we've always had a completely fictional presentation of Russia on every level. Everything about Russia that we think we know about Russia is just not true.
And Putin, the madman, the war criminal, it always has.
And then on top of that, you've had this unrestricted information warfare entirely from the Ukrainian nationalist perspective for the past 2 years. So this is, for a lot of people, this is the first time they've even heard the unadulterated Russian perspective. And we can't downplay how significant that is. The second...
Go ahead. I was just saying,
go ahead.
Kudos to Tucker for being true to his word, being unedited. It's just film to tape, and from beginning to end, it's just one unedited stream of, I guess, a teaching. As you said, a half an hour teaching of 1,000 years of history was amazing. But go ahead. Your second.
Yes, there was. Okay. And I was going to say that's Billy Bob. Because I could talk for like 5 minutes.
I was going to say, let's hit this one point home, because you just brought it up, and that was kind of the point I wanted to talk about. They have, you know, this unadulterated, psychological warfare, demonizing Putin and creating a caricature of Putin as this mastermind, evil person, always involved with everything, trying to undermine democracy and just hating everything that's good. And I think that one of the great things, if somebody sits and watches this interview, like, you know, he presents himself in a way that is entirely, you know, entirely different from, you know, how the Western public has been indoctrinated to you know, just to see Putin, really. So I think that was one of the best things. And anybody that sits down there and watches for 2 hours, like, you know, it's a joke that people need to understand how, you know, the West just, you know, bombards people with indoctrinated beliefs. and there's really a lot of anti-Putin hatred, and it's based on on a fantasy villain that doesn't exist. And furthermore, like the fact that they say that he's always meddling in Western democracies, trying to undermine democracies, trying to pick winners in our democracies and succeeding. Like none of that is true either.
Yeah, so much projection.
Yes, very much.
But okay, that's one thing I wanted to say.
And on that same point though about Putin, I will say it's one thing that I was a little bit disappointed about, because I don't think even Tucker Carlson himself got it, because the big takeaway here is Putin's not just speaking for himself, because we have this we like to take whole countries, whole societies, whole country, or whole cultures and boil them down to this lowest common denominator. China is this autocracy controlled by one man, Russia.
Xi Jinping.
Yes. They boil it down to this one strong man who controls everything. And really, that's not what Putin's talking about. He's just talking about the general feelings that Russians in general, whether or not he was president, just what people are feeling. I don't think Tucker he's still thinking in the terms of this is Putin speaking for Putin. He's representing, so when he talks about the feelings that when the Soviet Union was dismantled, there was this hope that was going to bring peace. That's a very common feeling in Russia. There was this kind of jubilant attitude. Okay, there's no reason to fight anymore. We're all just going to be one big unified world. I would say, and it's interesting because in one of his videos on his website, Tucker Carlson himself said this. He said it was I think he took this video in his hotel room right afterwards, and he said basically, I'll be thinking about this, probably for a year, which I think is good attitude. Yeah, because it's something he said. It sounds like he wants to continuously reflect on after this. Some interviews a journalist just does. I've done interviews, most of them I forget I even did them. They're not all noteworthy, but this is obviously one of the most worthy, if not, the top most noteworthy interview Tucker Carlson's ever done. He's going to be thinking about it for a year. I think that's the right attitude to approach this. There's continuing insights we can all go get from continuing to reflect on this moving forward.
So what do you guys think? I think Carlo has a long list of things, but do you have favorite moments or topics? Shall I start? Does anybody want to start?
Well, I'll just go ahead, Ben.
I like the dismantling of the bogeyman China thing that Tucker tried to push and absolutely dismantle it. I like it that Ukrainians and Russians, as you said, are one people because they said Russians never surrender when the Ukrainians were
too fast. You're jumping
too fast.
All right. Let's hit the China one. Let's explore that
point by point. Go ahead.
So I think this might have been the single most important aspect of the interview. And Tucker, we all know him. He's a bit of a China phobe, and so he gets he's more or less correct on the Russia issue. From an American perspective, why are we getting involved? Why are we taking Ukraine's side? It's a waste of money, blah, blah, blah. But on China, he is definitely a China hater.
Yeah.
And more than anything, he would like to see, a breaking apart of the relationship between Russia and China. He thinks that would be great for America. He wants to see that. And so you could see when he's talking to Putin, he's kind of pushing that. He's kind of pushing that. You're running from the arms of one empire right into the arms of the other, and that's what he's telling Putin. And Putin's not buying it.
Let me stop you there, Tucker. Yeah.
I would interject.
Okay,
I don't quite agree with. I think Tucker, because so he's a long time China hater. I have noticed he has mellowed significantly in the last few years. I think just our military adventures across the world have caused Tucker himself to reflect on whether that's a good idea. So I think he is just noticeably less pro-war than he used to be. So I think even with China, he doesn't like China. He dislikes China a lot. But even him, I've noticed he's toned down his rhetoric a lot. He would not be happy with U.S.-China war on any scale. I think that's true. I think, but I mean, just I do disagree on that one detail, Billy. But I don't think he's so much trying to split Russia and China as he would, as an American, like, and he's outright said this before. Like, there was a huge controversy about him saying this about 2.5 years ago. He's like, why aren't Russia and the USA allies? Because in that Cold War setup of three superpowers, when there's three, it's good to have one of those other two on your side. So it's 2 against 1. So in that Cold War mindset, it makes sense. Why is I can understand from that mindset. I understand Tucker's point too. If there's 3, it's crazy to get the other 2 to band up against you.
And they are banded up.
That's kind of what I was trying to say in different words. But I mean, he sees those 2 as, in a alliance more or less against the U.S. for good reason and obvious reasons. But he's not happy with that. And so you could see he's putting forth an effort to kind of,
create a new Sino-Soviet split, like back in the day, basically.
Well, they share a 1,000-mile border, as he pointed out.
Right.
Yes.
So there's the practical dimension to this, whereas the U.S. has just sent troops to the Kinmen Islands, which are just
50 kilometers
not even
off the coast,
kilometer from the Chinese border. It's a provocation, so they're going ahead with the provocation. For me, the most interesting part, if I'm going to switch, is valuable since I paid so much attention to the ninnies that make up the population in the U.S. I was paying attention to the way Putin laid out the lead up to the invasion, to the Russian claiming of Crimea and invasion of the Donbass, and I thought he did a very good job of that. And I think when I looked at the mainstream media, like as I did last night, that's what made them hysterical, because that aspect of it is the truth, unvarnished truth that they're hoping the American public can't grasp. The Maidan coup, Victoria Nuland's shit, the Minsk Accords, that sort of thing.
Yeah. In his words, we are ending a war that began in 2014.
Yes,
2014, exactly. And
so what are the ninnies saying? I mean, so you're saying the ninnies are not in agreement with Putin's explanation, and they want to cling to.
It's worse than that, Billy Bob. Just before we came on, we had the CNN on, and I think it's Mike Wallace. I think that's who it was. He literally said that Putin did not lay out the reasons for his invasion of Ukraine. I don't know what he was watching. Was he watching Daffy Duck of Bugs Bunny? I don't know what the fuck he's talking about, because he wasn't watching the interview I watched, and what I did was I followed it up with taking my hometown newspaper that had at least 4 opinion pieces on the interview, and I broke them down. It's kind of a lengthy thing, but
your hometown newspaper being the Washington Post, I think.
Well, so it's like the first headline was that I noticed was Putin in rambling interview. This woman who wrote this could not stand history. She probably fell asleep in her junior high history class. Barely lets Tucker Carlson get a word in, and then and in the course of her article, she doesn't mention the Maidan coup. She doesn't mention the Minsk Accords. She doesn't mention any of these things.
No context, just like in Israel. 10-7.
No context, not one. The second one, Putin interview with her name is Francesca Ebel. The second one, Putin interview with Tucker Carlson shows Kremlin outreach to Trump's GOP. Now, what could be more absurd than that? Robin Dixon and Natalia Abukumova, whatever. Anyway, my feeling about that is, if MAGA people were watching that, if Trump people were watching that, good, because now they have a context that they can grip a hold of, and it's the truth. I don't give a shit if it's MAGA people. But if they have the truth, that's what they need. That's,
I hope for the first time they actually, for me, what was surprising, there was nothing new there. I've been paying attention to this man for 2 years. There was nothing new to me in the whole historic lecture. But for many people, this probably is the first exposure to his
And let me
reasoning.
give some context to the Western response. So the context is they have tried to stop. I mean, they have made a concerted effort to stop Tucker from interviewing Putin, right? So Tucker's talked about this and how, I don't know if it was the CIA, but certain people, maybe the State Department, came to him and told him, we don't want you to interview Putin.
A year ago, yeah.
Yeah. And so now that he's, done it, and he's given the people that told him not to the finger, so to speak. What is the West going to do? I mean, so they're utilizing their media, outlets, their propaganda apparatus to try and disparage and to do whatever they can to keep people from watching it, and that's probably going to backfire, right? Because there's no what is that term? That there's no any publicity is good publicity, right? So if you're saying don't watch it, it's awful, that's going to make people watch it. So there's not,
and they can't stop themselves. They keep talking about the interview.
Yeah, and it's all they can do. It's their only play is to attack it and disparage it. But even that is going to just increase the amount of viewership, which is a good thing. So yeah, they're beside themselves. But
on that very point, can I add a couple of? They're obviously in damage control mode because one of the guys singled out was Boris Johnson. We have a short clip we can play for him. But one of my favorite headlines was from Gideon Rackman, like a Washington specialist in London. And this goes back to before the thing interviewed. And what he said was how Tucker Carlson became Putin's useful idiot in the Financial Times. And if you remember, before the interview aired, Hillary Clinton was in an interview saying he's a useful idiot. Tucker Carlson is a useful idiot for Putin before they saw anything. And the two preemptions I watched, one was in Europe, some kind of press briefing. And people might know Chen Weihua. He's a legendary Chinese CGTN journalist who called in like remotely and saying, what do you think about this interview? It looks like Europe is rather one-sided in this. And the guy reacted, and it was almost the same as I just watched John Kirby react to the interview, saying all of these are lies. The American people know better than to trust this horrible Vladimir Putin. And that to me it's insecurity. They know the narrative, I think, has crumbled. Go ahead, Carlo.
What I want to say is I just want to cover one more. This guy Bump, Philip Bump. His whole piece was on the New York Times journalist. What's his name? Gersakovich or whatever it is. And I wish that at that point Putin had mentioned Assange, because that would have been very effective. But the thing I really want to point out is in the comments section of the post, when I looked at it like at 1:00 in the morning last night, it had 4,800 and some comments, 76 comments. Now I've been barred. I'm lifetime barred from commenting on the post because I laid out the same thing that Putin laid out about the war in Ukraine. They barred me for life. But the comments were they were like hysterically anti-Putin. Hysterically. It was like people had heard a truth when they listened, and they had believed David Fromm and Bill Kristol, who had led them into the Iraq War, and they just with lies about WMD and Saddam Hussein working with terrorists, and now they've been fooled again. And there was at some level there was this realization that they've been lied to again, but they were not going to admit it. Because I know those people. I used to have a bookstore in the heart of upper Northwest Washington, D.C., and the Bethesda suburb, Chevy Chase, Bethesda. That's where all these people live. Dozens of them were my customers. Wow. And I don't go into names, but they will not admit they were wrong in their own heads, but they know. I think a lot of these people know that they've been duped, and I
think that anger comes from psychological pain.
Yeah, and aside from that, yes, exactly. And aside from the people who are in on it that live in Bethesda and Chevy Chase, other people are having to admit that once again they're in an Iraq situation where a country, the wrong country, was invaded. Like, you know, it was a huge mistake. Like
Yeah, they still
Vietnam,
call it that, a blunder and a mistake. That's
right?
what they
Like
call it.
Vietnam, a blunder and a mistake. Yeah. But anyway, that the the virulence was very revelatory toward substance, no substance, not a bit,
Just
not a bit.
anger.
What a surprise, Carlo. What
Yeah. Yeah.
Ben, I cut you off. You were listing things too fast. So what was your second thing?
I love this. Okay, a couple of things. Let's go to the CIA angle, because I don't know if you guys studied Tucker Carlson's face, as Vladimir Putin said, the CIA did that, the organization you tried to join once. And Tucker was just frozen in his seat. That was amazing. We are all lucky that you didn't join them. Who blew up Nord Stream also? You have an alibi, Mr. Tucker, but the CIA does not. Was wonderful.
I was busy that day. Yeah,
I was busy that day was a great response, wasn't it? Yeah. Fun. And they had fun. They actually, I think they had a giggle, both of them. A guy in politics as a leader, a statesman for 20 years, and he has a chuckle with Tucker Carlson. It was a nice moment. And the third one for me is Boris Johnson, because he got singled out for destroying peace like 18 months ago in Ukraine, and he got pointed the finger at. And I wonder if you guys would enjoy like a 23-second reaction that he just made somewhere in windy outskirts of perfidious Albion.
Around the world, people are watching that ludicrous interview with Vladimir Putin conducted by Tucker Carlson, and we must not fall for this tissue of lies, above all for the notion that Putin is somehow fated to succeed in Ukraine. On the contrary, he is doomed to fail. Read about it in the Daily Mail.
And again, for guys not in the UK, that is like the Sun level of tabloid. I don't know what the US equivalent is, but that's
National Enquirer.
Trash. National Enquirer. Okay.
That was a tissue of lies. Read about the truth at the National Enquirer. Yeah, the same kind of thing.
Ukrainians always say that Russian and Ukrainian are two completely separate languages. But I watch videos like that, and sometimes I find it hard to believe that British and Americans speak the same language. Look, that cheeky bastard. Putin did very well. It's like, what language are you speaking?
So the topic of soft power came up, and Putin, definitely, what's the word? Admitted, I guess, that the soft power apparatus of the West is the sole superpower of the world as far as soft power is concerned. So definitely the Russia can't compete with the soft power projection of the United States. And so people like Boris Johnson, people like the Washington Post, the entirety of the Western propaganda apparatus, they have no concern about truth. They don't care about truth. And they don't want to make an argument based on evidence, right? They're not interested in that. They just spam the narrative over and over in everybody's minds, and they think that's all they have to do, and they're going to win. And I mean, so far, that's been a good strategy, because people are so fucking stupid because of, this propaganda apparatus. But I think that it's losing its strength, and I think we can see, when things like this happen with a 2-hour interview, where we can listen to Putin directly, that's the kind of thing that can undercut, the efficacy of this propaganda apparatus. So I think that's a good thing. But yeah, they're not interested in having a debate. They don't want a debate because they're going to lose. They don't have truth on their side. They don't have any fucking evidence. So they just use their apparatus to just, spam the narrative at everybody. And they have a bunch of deliberate liars that are going to say it's true, that these lies are true, because they're materially interested in confusing everybody else. It's a battle over perception. It's a battle over people's opinions, and it's tough to compete with that. But things like this definitely help us. The people that are concerned about truth, and that's why they're so opposed to it. That's why they're so opposed of this interview, and they're trying to destroy it. So I think that's an important aspect of everything.
So terrified were they before the interview aired that the EU, that Belgian asshole called Guy Verhofstadt, I think, wanted to ban Tucker from entering the EU. Some US magazine published about prosecuting him under the Espionage Act.
Yeah.
That's how terrified they were. And I think Putin called it the propaganda war, where the West is a giant. On that point, I just saw this on Telegram. It's a short clip. I won't play it because it's subtitled in French and nobody wants that. But it was a guy called Nicolas Richaud. He's part of the French parliament. And on this interview on France 24, he said to counter the Russian narrative, France would have to flood the world with, he didn't call it fake news, but basically disinformation like we did in Africa. I thought that was hugely telling response. Like, shit, we lost the narrative in this battle because of Tucker. So we need to unleash basically a propaganda war. So I think they really lost the battle here with Tucker, based on the responses.
Well,
in the PR war. Go.
On that, and the Espionage Act, so you notice there were a couple of soft or feelers that Tucker's put out over the past, I'd say, about 2.5 years. He's put out feelers about this idea of interviewing Putin before, and he's been there's been official pushback each time he did it. So there was so the last time he'd done it, and then he just said the NSA was looking into his emails and threatening him and all this. So I think there was this long gap where he obviously, I mean, I'm sure he got legal consultation, and they said, okay, if someone was going to prosecute me, on what basis would they do so? So that lawyer who went viral saying here, and I think a couple of people lashed out at that lawyer for saying that. I watched that short clip he did. I don't think he was personally advocating for Tucker to be prosecuted. He was just saying if he's prosecuted, this is on how they might possibly do it. And the two things he said was the information transfer that happens between Tucker and Putin, like just when he fields, hey, Mr. Putin, here are the questions I'm going to ask you. Let's talk about it beforehand. Those are materials that could potentially be used against him. And the second point was something about I detrimental to the interests of the USA. I don't remember
so
exactly, but
I read
basically,
I read it in Newsweek, so I guess Newsweek picked this up. This guy you're talking about.
So it's interesting. Both of those points were touched on in the actual interview. So apparently there was basically no preparation. Like there wasn't any, as far as I can tell, there was no discussion about what specifically they were going to talk about. And I think that's probably deliberate. There's just there's just basically no paper trail at all. So if in the hypothetical case someone even wanted to prosecute Tucker, they'd have almost nothing to go with because there's just almost no communication prior to this. And also bringing up that journalist, what's his name? I can't even pronounce
Gershkovich.
Yes,
the spy.
Gershkovich. Bringing that up. So that's, I think, the second. I do think what's interesting is that this isn't the first time an American journalist who talked to Putin brought up somebody who is in prison there. I think this is the longest someone has talked about. So I think there could just be genuine concern, okay, there's another journalist who's locked up for some reason. So I think there's probably some genuine feeling in Tucker advocating for that much time that he did. But also it's a good argument if someone even suggests prosecuting and say, hey, I went there and spoke to the president of Russia about getting our guy back. That's beneficial to the interests of the USA. So I think that was all deliberate. That was all intentional just for Tucker to cover his bases, to make sure that he cannot be prosecuted for this. Because he's not an idiot. He talked to lawyers. He figured out, okay, how can I avoid not getting prosecuted if someone decides to? So he got his bases covered. I think that's apparent in how he conducted the interview.
And how about the response to the Gershkovich question? I think that was very, very telling. As in, he said, Russia has done goodwill gestures in the past, but they are never reciprocated, so we're not going to do one again.
Yeah.
I think what he inherited in the 90s and the 200s, basically, of the 2000s, his last vestiges of goodwill towards the West, I think are gone. And that includes Europe and the US. And I think that was him stating it as clearly as possible. Sorry, we're going east. But that's me saying it, not him. But to me, it was indicative of a shift in him. What do you guys think?
He also pointed out that there are back channels that with both governments that work on these things. And that had the effect of saying, look, the Russian government's not monolithic. It's not me. It's not me. There are people working on these problems as well as other problems, and which is absolutely true. That's the way governments operate, and so there are just ongoing discussions about the New York Times reporter. I won't try to pronounce his name either. Um, so it that was a good moment. But I agree with Ian. I think that's the reason Tucker brought it up. Absolutely.
Isn't it just bizarre though that he would have to worry about being prosecuted, in a liberal democracy for interviewing a head of state of another country? I mean, that's just crazy. And I mean, it exposes the lie of liberalism and the lie of democracy. But
the two flags of liberalism are the blue and yellow of Bandera fucking Ukraine and the David Star of basically Zionist. That tells you a lot.
Nazis and genocide.
Also, the irony is they admitted in the mainstream media that other journalists had interviewed Putin. So,
oh my God,
there's
Erin,
a
what's her
conflict
name?
there,
Did you see?
Yeah.
Did you see that collage of Erin something who interviewed Zelensky like they were in love, like they were on a date in the park? Absolutely.
It's like the Notebook. It was like the Notebook, that cheesy romance.
Yeah.
No, that they're going to kiss.
Gushing over the guy. Yeah.
I do want to mention, though, I think the most noteworthy point Putin made about this imprisoned journalist was that, making a media sensation out of him does not help, because there have been, besides Brittany Griner, there have been at least one other American deported from a Russian prison too. There was actually, I remember this actually happened almost at the same time Brittany Griner was released. There was this American woman who had gone to Russia to be with a boyfriend and apparently was beating him. It was a domestic violence case. The American girlfriend beating up her Russian boyfriend, and she actually went to prison for it. And they just deported. She was in jail and they deported her before her sentence was up. So in cases like that, where you're actually genuinely interested in the well-being of one of your citizens who got in trouble for whatever reason, it's generally better to not use it as political ammunition, because that just makes them think there's like, why should we give you this person back? But if you have people from one foreign ministry talking to another foreign ministry, hey, let's just get this person back to their own
and there was
country.
an exchange for Victor Boot, right? Brittany Griner was in a deal with for Victor Boot. So that wasn't necessarily a goodwill. That was more of a a transactional kind of thing. But
by the way, it has to be noted on the guy we can't pronounce, but I'll try, Mr. Gershkovich, that he was arrested at the Uralvagonzavod, the heart of the military industrial complex of Russia, right? Okay.
He was committing espionage. It was
absolutely he was, and Putin said, I don't think he was acting in the interest of Monte Carlo or something like that. I think he was acting in the interests of the U.S. Don't you think, Mr. Carlson? So
let's face it. I mean, I know people who, when they traveled to Russia or China or Italy, anywhere in Europe, when they got off the plane, if they were in a certain position, that is, if they were journalists or they were heads of corporations or vice presidents or whatever, they were interviewed at the airport by the FBI and State Department, which is a euphemism for CIA. So this guy would have given up everything he had. New York Times guy would have given up everything he had at the airport when he got back to the U.S. He would, yes, everything he found would be in the hands of U.S. intelligence and U.S. law enforcement. I also wanted to say, where's the U.S. get off when they hold this Huawei executive, or they arrest the Venezuelan who was just trying to feed, I can't remember their name.
Correct.
Trying to feed their people, and lock them up in a maximum security prison.
Carlo, it's the rules-based order. What don't you understand?
I just can't get it, Billy Bob. I just can't get my head around it.
On that very point, Carlo, by the way, at the same time as Mr. Warm-hearted but elderly man who has trouble with his memory, Mr. Joe Biden says Al-Sisi is the president of Mexico. You know, after speaking to two dead European.
Iran and Cole.
Yeah. Yes, Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl. But that, what I think, what do you call it? Tucker Carlson asked about this, and it was really interesting that he said the presidents don't really rule in the U.S., which is obvious to us, I think, for many years. But it's interesting to hear it from them. What Trump calls the deep state, but I prefer, you know, the permanent state, the huge bureaucracy underneath. Putin clearly said it. Those are the guys. We don't. That's why I don't remember ever talking to Biden, because who would? But people are talking to that America.
Yeah, that's absolutely
Thanks,
true.
Geggy.
You guys are too young, but I lived through the Reagan years, and that guy served 2 terms, and he couldn't count to 5. If he went off script, it got crazy. So
Alzheimer's, and that's definitely in the second term. He had some very serious Alzheimer's.
And of course, another good case is Truman. I mean, Jimmy Burns just led him around by the nose. That guy, I don't know if he was mentally ill, but I remember Oppenheimer, after he lost his security clearances, was given the task of keeping Truman informed about advances in nuclear energy, and Oppenheimer had some very disparaging remarks to make about Truman's mental capacity.
I didn't know Truman was like Biden. Basically.
I did not know that either.
No, I think it was. I think he was just stupid. That's the difference between Trump and Biden. I think Trump has always been an idiot. He's always been stupid, and these gaffes are just a product of who he is. I think he probably said stupid things when he was 24 that he's saying now when he's 77 or 78, whatever he is.
Whereas Biden is, I think the New York Post ran a headline, is just elder abuse. He's just demented.
He is. He's just gone. And it's cruel in a certain sense to keep an individual like that in this position. But he seems determined to stay there anyway. And he's obviously not running the show. So
yeah. So Jim Garrison was for Louisiana Parish, the district attorney or something, and he was investigating the JFK assassination.
Right.
He did in 1969, he did an interview with a French magazine, and he made the point, way back then, that the president is free to, change the drapes and put any color of drapes they want in the White House, but they just are not allowed to encroach on the foreign policy domain, which is of the permanent state. So that, I would recommend that interview because, 1969, they were dealing with the same issues and they had the same exact analysis that we have today.
By the way, you probably know this, that Hungary is suffering the exact same position in the EU, that we are not supposed to be making foreign policy decisions. Brussels is supposed to do that, and there's an ongoing fight there, exactly the same as that.
Well, Brussels was democratically elected. The European people overwhelmingly voted to put Brussels in power, so that just makes sense. It's not like a corporate oligarchy or anything.
I would say to bring up the issue of the of Putin's frustration with literally not knowing who to talk, and that's when he mentioned that conversation with Clinton. Who do I talk to? Who is in charge? It's like going into a restaurant. I want to speak to the manager, and there is no manager, or they have a manager, but he's clearly not the person who runs the place. It's and what's interesting, he mentioned by name. He mentioned Clinton. He mentioned Biden by name because he came up in conversation.
One of the Bushes too.
He mentioned Bush. Who did not come up was Obama. Despite, because both Syria and the Crimea, the Maidan issue came up. So you'd think there would be, but I think, and I have a theory, I can't read Putin's mind, but I think Bush Jr. was probably the last president who tried to be a president. Now, of course, Bush was a moron. He is a moron, but he tried. But from that point on, it became a figurehead. Obama was a figurehead. He's born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He was the figurehead. He was the designated person to be president even before the election.
Absolutely.
And he was just a figurehead. And that was the idea from that point onwards. You have this guy, but he's not actually in charge of anything. Yeah, very revealing.
Something
It's
that
very-
was also revealing to me in when he addressed these people, meaning Trump, Clinton, I think Bush, that he said he liked them. There wasn't anything disparaging. He wasn't calling them names, dictator, all that stuff. Not once. Of course, he didn't mention Nuland because I don't think he would be courteous to that, to the Moscow,
Well,
what do you call it? The Maidan midwife.
Newland's also not on his level. If you listen to how
True.
Putin talks, he tends to mention people who are at his level. It's just
And he said one of the vice State Department heads. I think he mentioned Nuland without a name at one point in connection with Maidan.
He's very calculating about who he mentions by name and who he doesn't, and that's consistent with him.
So this is a good topic I want to say a few things on. We're talking about the nature of how the power structure works in the West. And, I know Ben and I, we're Marxist Leninists, and we understand that it's essentially a class-based dictatorship. It's the dictatorship of the capitalist class, also known as an oligarchy. But in an oligarchy, like who do you speak with? If it's organized in the benefit of a specific class of wealthy elites, what one person can you go to negotiate things? Well, ostensibly it's, the government that gets put in place, but that government is powerless to oppose the interests of the class of which that government serves, the class
Chase
of people.
Manhattan, BlackRock, the actual interests. Yeah.
The banksters, the industrialists, the oligarchs, the plutocrats. I mean, there's a whole
Raytheon, Lockheed Martin. Yep.
bunch of them. And, if the government, does something in opposition to the interests of that class, well, the class isn't going to just take it. They're going to do something about whoever in government is making those problems, which brings me to Annalena Baerbock, who they just discovered that her grandfather's a Nazi. Like they didn't know that.
He died recently. So it's not like, she was 6 when he died. He died recently. So she knew. So he was a paternal figure to her.
So
and he always
go ahead. This is coming out because she has said some things, pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli kind of sentiment, and so all of a sudden they're out to get her because who is she? She's just a fucking functionary in their government, and if she gets out of line, they're going to knock her down. That's just how the class dictatorship operates. And I think it's very similar to Trump. If Trump wasn't going to do everything they wanted exactly how they wanted, they were going to go after him, even though he gave them, 90% of everything they wanted. So, this is how the class dictatorship works. There's not one person that is in charge that you can go to. And that's why it's like a Titanic that, it's heading in the wrong direction. And you can't just turn it around. Like it's like literally impossible to just turn it around, because if somebody says, "Hey guys, we're going the wrong way," they're gonna bite his head off. And I
got 2 questions for you guys, and they're not connected at all. One is, can we discuss Putin's denazification comments? And secondly, my wife, she insists that I forgot what she insists. Anyway, can we discuss the denazification?
Yeah.
Denazification was not discussed according to the media. Like not a single mainstream article I saw anywhere in the American press even had the words denazification. They didn't even mention it. That was a major talking point in the conversation, was the denazification, which was very clearly defined, because Tucker did ask, what does that mean? It's a cool word, but in practical terms, what does that mean? And Putin was very clear, because Ukraine celebrates Nazism, it celebrates Nazi collaborators and actual Nazis in World War II. It's a very easily defined attribute of the Ukrainian government that needs to be removed.
And Tucker was thinking, well, it's going to be so impossible. How on earth can you get the Nazi out of that culture? And it was interesting, Putin's response. I found that response very interesting. He said, well, we had it. It was a done deal. They were going to agree to this. They were going to no longer allow, the celebration and the naming of streets after these people. And they were going to, do all these cultural changes before Mr. Whoever we were watching earlier came and, ruined their agreement.
Boris.
Boris Johnson. Yeah. So it's interesting that, to Putin, like, it's not hard. You get an authority, a state authority in power that is in agreement that not, and he also made the point that, is that controversial? Is fucking denazification controversial? It's not, because the West pretends to oppose Nazis. And so all we're saying is, well, let's just oppose Nazis then. Like, how hard is that? Go ahead, Ben. Sorry.
Another favorite point of that, and that I would add, is the one point where I found Tucker a little bit unprepared. He immediately said, but that was 80 years ago. And Putin said, okay, Yaroslav Honka, the actual SS fuckhead, was to a standing applause just a couple of months ago in Parliament. This is active. This is now. And he went on Bandera, on Shukevich, on these criminals. And I talked about this with Regis. I saw some sort of presser with him and the Belarusian president Lukashenko in Leningrad, in St. Petersburg, after 80 years of surviving the siege, where his brother died. And he said Russia, with all its might, or everything that is in its power, will eradicate this ideology once and for all, both in Ukraine and the Baltics. I thought that was significant. And just a couple of points I'm sharing with you. You can see Mein Opad und die Nazis was the Bild cover piece for Mr. Miss Baerbock 360, who's crying apparently. And what I'm loving, I don't have it right now, but in Hungarian media, they're going after Mr. Orban, saying he's a Nazi aligned with Putin. And we just discovered Mr. Donald Tusk, the Polish president's granddad, Josef Tusk, was exactly a decorated asshole like this one. So yeah, this has been an open secret. The EU, the first NATO representatives were from the Reich, basically, laundered by the US, and it has to come to an end. Go ahead, Billy Bob.
Make the further point about the timing, right? It's not like this is something that the Bild just discovered. Like, this is stuff that the Bild can turn into a story to undermine people who step out of line. And if Donald Tusk, decides to step out of line and, work some kind of a deal with Putin, well, guess what? He's going to be vilified and attacked as a Nazi. And, he's going to get kicked out of power. They're going to put somebody else in charge that will do what they want. So
currently they love Tusk, though. Only Hungary doesn't.
No, of course. And they did love Baerbock before. And then she's like expresses some pro-Palestine sentiment, and all of a sudden she's a Nazi. Like, the timing is everything. It just needs to be pointed out.
I can't wait for the day when the NAFO-tards, the people with the flags, saying, when this comes to an end and it's serious, there's going to be denazification. You can they're going to be, I was a chef, I was just following orders. I can't wait for that day, personally.
Yeah. What about, I'm curious, Ben, what happened to Orban that he flipped on European aid to Ukraine?
Well, he was forced into
blackmail, right?
Basically blackmail. He said, I went to the wall, which it's nothing to do with execution, meaning I explored every option and there wasn't one. If I said no, if I vetoed the 50 billion aid for 4 years, then they would have taken our money, they would have sent our stuff to Ukraine, and there was no point in putting Hungary into that precarious position. And even since then, they have it out for him. Like the US ambassador in Hungary saying, we have tools, we can do even more damage to you. Europe is talking about sanctioning Hungary. It's absolutely ridiculous.
What actually happened? Because there were two conflicting, and there might have been a follow-up confirming one or the other, but I missed it because Orban initially said he had some concessions in regards to issues Hungary had with the EU, and the EU in turn said no, Orban got nothing. He just did what he wanted. Who turned out to be right?
The concessions he talks about is some of the COVID funds. We are talking about 5 years ago now. Okay, COVID funds being released to Hungary, and he wanted there to be a review every year so we can decide if we're going to continue sending the aid. And basically what he got instead of that is a little moderate discussion. We're still going to send stuff, but we're going to discuss how much and where. But there's no stopping this aid for the next 4 years. So he didn't really get much, but I enjoyed the next move in the chess game where I don't know if you've seen the picture, but there was a special parliament session in Hungary where we were supposed to okay Sweden's entry into NATO, and the horseshoe, like 2/3 of it is Fidesz, which is the coalition that rules Orban's party. It was just empty. so they couldn't do it. And there were like 14 NATO foreign ministers there, and now they're demanding that you let Sweden into the NATO, and Orban says, "Fuck you, give us something." So we're still there's a lot of battles going around in Europe right now. The Nord Stream investigation has concluded. We don't know. It's just going to be an eternal mystery. The farmers are surrounding Rome. It's amazing what's going on here, but I don't want to sidetrack the main discussion.
So I agree with Kegi here on the UN becoming kind of useless due to U.S. monopolism, really, of the whole institution. But it's still, I mean, we need international organizations like that. We just don't need the U.S. to have so much influence over it. So I'm not opposed to the UN, but I'm opposed to U.S. Hegemony in the UN.
Yeah. The two countries spearheading reform are China and Russia. Reform of the UN structure.
That Security Council with the veto power exists to begin with, more than anything else, is to prevent a World War III, a nuclear World War III, and it's frustrating because if just one person on that Security Council vetoes it, then you get nothing. But that's the reason.
And Ian, may I add, it's based on the power relations of 1945. I mean, France, Britain, that can't get a fucking aircraft carrier to sail, is there. What are they doing there? I mean, I would argue Kazakhstan is a larger player than Britain right now.
Well, they have nukes. They don't have a lot of nukes, but they have 2 submarines with nukes. They can ruin somebody's day. And that's,
they have
unfortunately. It's the.
I mean, that wouldn't be a good idea for an island to attack another nuclear power, at least. But yeah, no, they could definitely threaten and use it as blackmail, leverage. I mean,
yeah.
And then they're the U.S. supports them and undercuts their currency. They trade pounds for U.S. dollars, which is why the pound is still solvent. But it's a symbiotic relationship. The UK, the US, Israel, the US, Ukraine and the US.
By the way, can I say something new that I like about this, the tussle between Orban and the EU, that I think there's a huge unmasking, like under the guise of this is democratic and voter-based and human rights-based. It looks like it always was horse trading, you get this, I get this, that's it, under the guise of democracy. Nothing made it more clear to me than Sergei Lavrov in one of his English interviews said, why do you think 100 nations said bad things about Russia during the invasion? And Lavrov calmly said, well, the US approached these people and said, I know where your son is in this US university. And this chick, I don't know if it was Christiane Amanpour or one of these foreign correspondents, said, are you meaning to say that some of these people were basically threatened by the US? And Lavrov just said, not one, not few, all of them. That was his answer, like a mic drop moment. And that's always what's been going on in the EU, in the UN, and all of these international.
I think there were 2 interesting aspects to the Putin interview. One was when he talked about the yuan ruble exchange, and that was very interesting. And the other was, of course, why would he want to invade Lithuania or Poland? And that segues into some comments that the higher up military people in Britain said they have no military now. They don't have the money for it. They couldn't. There was talk of sending British troops to Ukraine to help fight, which is a non-starter. But the general comment among military brass was, we don't have the people to do it. We don't have the armaments to do it. So it's moved from both ends. But I thought the yuan ruble comment was interesting. The percentage was very high. I can't remember, 30% or something.
It went up from something like yes, you're right. It was the majority of their transactions were in US dollars because that was the convenient international currency, and now it's a small minority of Russia's transactions are US dollars.
Rightly so. And that seems to be the path of many, many countries. I mean, this thing is speeding up.
It's because of the sanctions.
And he also mentioned the economy, saying, well, we grew faster than all of the G7 countries. Thank you very much for all those sanctions. And he's right. And of course, when he mentioned China, the boogeyman story, he said, you're cutting yourself off. You're hurting yourself from the economic powerhouse of the world. Basically, I'm paraphrasing. And you're doing yourself a disservice, which was a great answer.
But the big thing is, I want to bring up that, because one he did bring up, it was the weaponization of the dollar that caused the problem. If it's weaponized once, it can be weaponized against anybody.
Even Elon Musk on his platform X said we overplayed our hand with the dollar. He's having basically remorse,
And what was interesting, I would say, and just before we get distracted to another aspect of the conversation, but just on that issue of unipolarity versus multipolarity. And, I've said this before, Putin is, a moderate globalist, right from the beginning after Yeltsin resigned and Putin was elected, I think it was in March that following year after Yeltsin resigned. He has been pushing for closer ties with Germany, with closer ties with the USA. Putin is completely fair to say Putin is a globalist. And he did reiterate that in the interview. He does not want, and that's a very common accusation against Putin. Oh, he wants us to take us back to the 19th century where we have spheres of influence. Like, no, he doesn't.
He's not creating blocks. We are. The West is.
Not at all. He would, and he said it himself, he would like just to have international institutions and international cooperation, no spheres of influence or blocks. And he still believes that. He just does not see a path forward with that idea. That's the issue.
On that point, I think you might be attending the upcoming friendship games. Basically, they had enough of the Olympic shit. They're doing alternative institutions. And I'm hoping that BRICS, which is by no means like a centralized alliance, could come up with something like an international court, like a forum, like the UN. A lot of people are saying maybe this can't be reformed. China and Russia is trying, but maybe it's beyond repair and we need something else. True.
I wanted to make the point about the title of our program, which is called Blowback, Exposing Imperialist Decline. And I think, when we were talking about the US dollar hegemony in decline, that's definitely one of the biggest aspects of imperial decline. So the Yeltsin thing, it was interesting. I'm not sure what was going on with that. I mean, I think he was taking a cue from Khrushchev shitting on Stalin, and he opted not to go down that road and shit on Yeltsin, even though Yeltsin obviously was and is, well, he was a drunk of epic proportions, and he sold Russia out. But yeah, Putin was, kept the gloves on for sure, and didn't call him a drunk. Shoot, there was one other thing I wanted to. Okay, we just talked about
Russians don't surrender. We're going to talk about that.
Oh, the
we
finals.
haven't talked about that yet. We can talk about that.
Before that,
sure.
Since we were going eastward, Happy New Year in case there's someone Chinese out there, because it's now the year of Long, the dragon. And I want to show you, this is not a war scene. This is basically, you can put it on screen, what Guangxi City in China looked like at midnight.
The new year.
Do you think you can sanction this? Do you think you can do what they did to Russia to this? I mean, it's so ridiculous. I read somewhere the BASF, the German chemical manufacturer, is ceasing its activities in Xinjiang because they got a letter from the NED, from the Open Societies Foundation, saying, look, that Uyghur slave labor, America is separating forcefully Europe and China, just like they did with, Germany and China, just like they did Germany and Russia. And it's horrific. All the economic news, Scholz is in the White House, basically, come on, begging people, you have to support Ukraine. We can't do it on our own, while his country is going down the shitter economically. Okay, sorry. Well, what were you, the Russians don't surrender part, or you had another thought, Billy Bob?
No, my thoughts escaped, but we can definitely go to Russians don't surrender. So we heard Scott Ritter tell that story. I've heard him tell it a couple of times, and Putin shared the same story with
Tucker,
Carlson,
right at the
Tucker Carlson. Yeah. So, and the point is that there's not two separate people, right? It's like they're brothers, they're cousins. It's one people, and it's really one language because Russia was the dominant language in Ukraine also. And
Ukraine
Zelensky
is a
didn't even.
dialect. Yeah.
Zelensky had to learn how to speak Ukrainian. And so no, so to me, I mean that's an interesting aspect of the whole conflict. Putin wants to put forth an argument that these people who see themselves as Ukrainian and are anti-Russian are kind of deluded, and they're delusional because it's one people. And whereas you have the Ukrainian ultra nationalists want to talk up this idea of Ukrainian peoplehood, and we're a distinct group and we're separate, and you guys want to oppress us, and that's why we need our independence, and we're going to fight you to the death because our peoplehood and personhood is so important to us, our identity, our Ukrainian identity, which kind of does get us into this
you want to talk about Lenin? I know it.
well, yeah, that's where so Putin kind of is criticizing Lenin a little bit for Lenin's eagerness to create a union of different peoples and different cultures and give some autonomy to the different areas, and to respect the differences of culture and identity in these different areas. That was kind of Lenin's approach to the Soviet Union. And I've heard Putin on more than one occasion kind of disparage this attitude of can you help me?
Billy Bob, he can't do it, can he? He can't do a single interview without shitting on either Stalin or Lenin, and it also hurts me a little bit.
So okay, let me say this. So number one, he's pretty diplomatic. Putin is pretty diplomatic. I don't really see him shitting on Lenin or Stalin. He asks. I mean, you could say he is, but he does it very diplomatically. So he asked the question. I don't know why Lenin did this, is what he says. So, I mean, that's the extent of it. That's the extent of his criticism. He's like, I don't know why Lenin did this. And then with Stalin, he talks about, the alleged, some people allege that he committed human rights violations and things like that. So his criticism is pretty diplomatic. But I wanted to discuss, where he's coming from, and can we give a defense about the way that Lenin went about forming the union and thinking that, he didn't foresee, the future. He couldn't look at, 100 years into the future and see, how the West was going to utilize this Ukrainian nationalism. So can we defend him for?
I can.
Can you do it for everybody?
First, the story, because you didn't quite describe it. When Ukrainians were surrounded, they switched to perfect Russian, and they said Russians don't surrender, and they all perished. Basically, that's how you revert to the mother culture. And I'm not a very spiritual person, I don't believe, but I thought there was something beautiful in the Ukrainian soul will find its way home, just like the Belarusians did, or something like that. But going back to Lenin, he's been dead for a fucking 100 years, and they still blame him. But he was insistent on encouraging cultures of different groups. I mean, within Russia, there's something like 50 nationalities. If you look at Yakutia, it couldn't be more different than Grozny, Chechnya. It's like two different things, but they're all within the unity of Russia. But it was, so he always encouraged this, but he didn't foresee that after 1945, the Great Patriotic War, the CIA embedded itself in Kiev and Lvov, the western part of it, and encouraged the OUN, the Banderite fascist forces who were allied with Nazi Germany, and slaughtered a bunch of Poles and formed the culture around that. And it spread like poison. Lenin couldn't foresee that. It's not his fault, because it could have stayed, for instance, part of Russia, just like all the other constituting republics. But it went separate, and it got way, way much funding for 80 years now. I don't think bringing Lenin into this at this point is very helpful. But there's something that's interesting in Russia. There's a lot of Lenin statues, but Lenin, I'm going to say he dunks on him a bit. But he does considerably less with Stalin. I think he's kind of made his peace, because the great victory in 1945, that everybody pretty much agrees that's Stalin. So he stays away from him, or he kind of even praises Joseph Stalin from time to time, but Lenin remains the boogeyman in Putin's world. And so I'm never going to love the guy. I really support Putin, but yeah, that's something that just hurts, to me.
Well, I'll interject to say that when in the context of Russians complaining about Russian leaders, it's in the same context as in any other country. And I think that is lost now because I think Americans cancel culture is starting with our own. Because if someone asks me, what do you think of George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, Patrick Buchanan, Hoover, or any of our previous presidents, just like you ask Russians, what do you think of Stalin or Lenin? I can say, well, here's the reasons I like George Washington. Here's the reasons I don't like George Washington. It's the same thing. Because I could list the positive things I like about our first president. I could list off a bunch of things I don't like him. But the interesting thing is no one even asks me that question because we've kind of erased our own history to an extent. So we project that on Russians. If you say something slightly negative about Lenin, it means Lenin was like a dictator, he's a terrible person. It's not true. Putin, I'm sure personally, whether or not he was president, has things he likes about Lenin and Stalin, but there's also controversies, just like Gorbachev and Khrushchev and every other Russian.
True. And just to add to that when the Soviet Union was born, that was a bloody, bloody period. It was under siege by 14 invading armies. Also the civil war between the Reds and the Whites. So it's not remembered very fondly, I think, in the Russian psyche.
It's killed more people than World War I. And now just imagine having the casualties of World War I and then immediately after World War I having more losses.
Right.
Stunning.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So I would mention just on the question of, one, I'll bring up that in Russian, there are different words for it, but in general usage, nationality and ethnicity are the same words. And so, and it says it on your passport. Actually, if you have a Russian passport, it will say, and actually in Russian, it's two different words. This gets lost in translation with English speakers. So most don't know this. I did not know this until I started taking Russian, but it's two different words, Rossiyskiy, Rossiyskaya, or Ruski, which is, we're referencing to the ethnic Russian people and culture. And then there's Rossiyskiy, which is the political term. I have a Rossiyskiy passport. So as a federation, the Russian Federation has those 50 or more ethnicities or nationalities. But then there's the Russian ethnicity and the Russian culture. And they are, so when it comes to communism, you'll notice that Western communism and Eastern Russian communism are different. That's because every culture, when they take this ideology,
also because
they project their own culture.
The former doesn't exist, I'd argue.
Right. So I read Lenin's wife's biography of him, and she mentions that, because she was a Nadia Krupskaya, so she was a disenfranchised noble woman, a person of noble birth, but no money, basically. And she mentioned that these before Marxism, you had these angry, upset people in Russian culture. And she described it as very interesting as they were directionless. They were angry. They knew things were wrong. They know why. Then, and it's a very interesting story because the Tsar actually authorized Marx's Das Kapital to be translated into Russian because his censors looked at it and said, "This is the most boring thing I've ever read."
And it really is.
Yes, it is.
It's a hard book.
Yeah. It's not an easy book. And I read the condensed 1-volume version. I did not even attempt to read the original 8 volumes. But then once they read Marx, then that gave them, a direction. They said, okay, now we have a direction to work with. So it was very significant for us when they got Marx.
You remember all the posters, the propaganda was Lenin pointing. That's basically him showing the direction to these people. Yeah.
Well, and if you look at Russian sculptures, Stalin and Lenin are portrayed differently. Lenin is always a dynamic figure stepping forward, and Stalin is like a wall. He's portrayed as a wall, a stalwart. Yes.
True.
Yes.
I didn't notice. Yeah.
Yes. But oh my gosh, where was I going with that? But as far as nationality, so as far as Lenin, he's culture, and I think that's a Russian. I think for every culture, your greatest strength is it's not just a silly thing to say. It's true. Your greatest strength is also your greatest weakness. So Russia is this very diverse. You could even call it woke. I know that's like almost a bad word, in American political discourse. But Russians' version of woke is that they love all these little micro groups, these subcultures within their own culture, and it's very exciting. Just even talking to Russians, okay, we got Tatars, we got Chechens, we got blah 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 blah. And so it shouldn't be a huge surprise that when you had Marxism, we had communism that was introduced to Russian culture, and they Russified the idea. They projected pre-existing values in that. So they decided, okay, the Soviet Union is going to be this very woke, very diverse, where we're going to embrace all these microcultures, make sure these secondary languages and these secondary cultural values are taught. If there's a tribal language that just never had a writing system, we'll give it a writing system.
True.
And that's the reason they all exist today.
I don't remember which Lenin biography this was, but I read somewhere that this idea was born in Germany and Paris cafes, and it went east and therefore got Easternized, as you said, Russified. It's a very unique, the Soviet experience. Good point.
And Ben made a good point too about the CIA being involved in Ukraine, right in 1945. And I just wanted to mention that Doug Valentine has written extensively on that subject. He's done some very good work. Ben, you expressed before the show some interest in knowing what's going on domestically here in the U.S. with the Congress.
Yes, where is the Ukraine aid at this point? I haven't followed.
It's failed. It's failed again. What the Democrats and some Republicans are trying to do is to separate out the three factors:
Israel, the border,
aid to Ukraine, and the border, and border crossings, immigrants coming in, and the stickler is the immigrants, and Trump has said, look, don't vote yes on the on the border crossing, because that'll give you want to have it being a mess right through the election, so that I can use it as a political ploy, and that's just politics, but it's blatantly out there, and then you get people like Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about indictments and unable to actually read her own document without messing up a half a dozen words in it. But they're trying to separate out the three things, or at least get the aid to Israel and Ukraine separated from the border crossing. And that's just one of the fascinating things about U.S. bills is they can have all kinds of
irrelevant
substance that doesn't pertain one to the other. It can be very variable, and usually there's a lot of pork thrown in at the end as a kind of bribe to the voters in certain regions. But that's where it stands now. They're whether they can separate it out or not, and is
so the Republicans want funding for the border wall, but they don't want to fund Ukraine, but they do want to fund Israel. And then the Democrats say, well, we're not going to fund the border wall, but we want to fund Ukraine. And then there's
first Biden bundled the whole thing and it collapsed, right? And now they're trying the separate approach.
Yeah,
I just came across, Jackson Hinkle shared this. I haven't looked into it. I don't know who Representative Anna Paulina Luna is, but have you seen this? This is obviously for the media, trying to introduce a bill that any member of Congress that supports the 60 billion Ukraine proposal should go to the front. Isn't that? It's just for the media, but I thought it was fun.
They're probably not going to pass that one, Ben.
Yeah, unlikely, isn't it? I mean, the whole thing would collapse. Congress, Senate.
Yeah, and I think, I'll still stick by my guns on that thing I've been telling you guys, in our previous shows too. Because, and the thing is, and I've had people, because I post a lot on Quora and, social media too. Some people are very excited. They're like, oh, the war is about to be over because there's no money. And it's just like, no, because, and that's the thing to say, well, Republicans oppose Ukraine aid, and I tell them, it's like, no, that's not true. Some Republicans do. Some Republicans do. They do absolutely oppose more aid to Ukraine for various reasons, but the majority don't. They just don't care. And when you don't care, you're like, okay, it's just like, it's like a divorce case, or any other legal battle. You're just like, okay, I see my opponent is extremely passionate about this thing, and I don't care. So I can use that as a bartering chip. So that gives Republicans leverage. They say, I don't, because the average Republican says, you know what? I don't care. I don't care if Ukraine collapses tomorrow. But Democrats do.
That's the thing. I think you put your finger right on the post there. That Biden needs Ukraine not to lose until the election. I think that is what this 60 billion is absolutely about. And I love the British press in particular. Avdiivka is obviously surrounded in a cauldron about to fall. And the Telegraph had this, I'm paraphrasing, but I found this headline. If this Ukrainian city is lost to the Russians, then it will be America's fault. That's what Britain...
I saw that.
It's amazing what these guys are doing. Do you guys, in relation to this, do you guys want to discuss what's your thoughts on the current, the musical chairs has ended in Kiev and there's been a reshuffle?
Oh,
so
yes, I want to talk about that, but I would like, before we move on to that, hit on the no, not at all. I'd be sorry. I know if I forget, I'll never mention it. But the Russians do not surrender. I had a thought on that.
Good.
So that was the closing thoughts. That was basically the last thing said in that interview, where he shared that story of these Ukrainian soldiers who were, and this happens on both sides because it's a full-scale peer-on-peer war. You have incidents of groups of soldiers being just trapped, cut off by a superior force. And so in this case, it was the Ukrainians who were surrounded by Russians, and the Russians told them, okay, it's hopeless. Just give yourselves up, spare your lives. And the Ukrainians said,
Russians don't surrender.
And that's interesting because there was when the withdrawal from Afghanistan, there was a viral meme on Russian Twitter, actually, that because when the USA left Afghanistan, they did not care about any of their allies. They just left them, especially.
You're talking the US withdrawal, okay? Yep.
Yes.
The airplanes around Kabul, the people. Yep.
Yes, especially if you were not from a national army, if you were just a private contractor, they cared even less about you. So there were a lot of Poles, Ukrainians, and these other random groups of people isolated in Afghanistan. And this went viral on Russian Twitter. These Ukrainian guys were complaining. They were just like, I'm stuck in Kabul. And people come up to me and they ask me, okay, you're obviously not an Afghan person. Who are you? And I have to tell them I am a Russian. So, and it's very funny because, and Afghans, of course, have a long history with Russia, even before the Afghan-Soviet war, just during they have a history. They just say, oh, who are you? I'm a Russian. Oh, okay, you're a Russian in Afghanistan. Okay, and they leave them alone. And so... And the Ukrainians, of course, were not happy about saying they were Russians. They're just like, I had to tell people I'm Russian. But Russians do not surrender. I'm reading a book by Medinsky, who's the former Russian Minister of Culture. He retired from that position about 4 years ago. And I'm reading his book about World War II. It's like a day by day of the Great Patriotic War. And that's a very common story. And it's happened multiple times where you have one soldier or a group of soldiers surrounded by the Germans and they tell them to give themselves up. These Russians don't surrender.
And let's not forget, a lot of Ukrainians fought in the Red Army and died in the Great Patriotic War.
Because they're just one people. So it's one of those stories, the way it's been described to you, it's described to me. It's one of those stories that started as fact, went into legend, and then came back into fact. So it's just in their mentality. And actually about 4 years ago, even before I really knew anything about it, just on Amazon Prime, I just came across this random, it's honestly a very stupid movie. It was this Russian, on Amazon Prime, is this Russian like gangster movie. This Wagner guy comes back from Africa, falls in with these gangsters, and this one group of gangsters decides they're going to steal money from this other group of Russian gangsters. So they break into this rich gangster's mansion and get the drop on the other group of gangsters. They're all criminals. They're not good people. They're all criminals. So the one group of gangsters tells the other group of gangsters, we have the drop on you. It's hopeless. Give yourselves up. And they say, Russians don't surrender. And so it's
art
kind of
imitating real life, imitating art. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a cultural thing, even outside of military context. It's just a thing they'll say. And I think there might have been a sense of irony when the Ukrainians say, well, fuck you, Russians don't surrender. But, it's still, irony is a Russian trait, too. So it's very interesting.
Want to quickly respond. That was almost the last beat of the interview when he said afterwards that the Russian soul and the Ukrainian soul will find its way home. And then he said, are we done? Do you have any other questions? Perfect ending. I wonder if you've seen this, a couple of weeks old, but this is In the Trenches.
Туманы над рекой.
That is the Russians singing the Katyusha, a patriotic song, and the Ukrainians responding, singing it together. So, yeah, that's the reality that was being obscured by so many years.
And you can see how Tucker was moved, because that's, for us, is a very rare story. Because we never talk about can you imagine an American saying that about Iraqis or Germans, even?
No, it's alien, isn't it?
Aliens. It's just and you can see, if you look at Tucker's face, he was moved probably more than any other point. He was moved by that, because it's, for us, it's so unusual. It's a very moving story. You're just like, it was shocking to him. I think that was very poignant moments.
Before we go to musical cheers, I remembered what I was forgetting last time. I had some words on globalism. You guys were talking about globalism and is Putin a globalist? I wanted to talk about that some more, but we can do that after musical chairs. And Carlo, you had something to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to segue into the topic of Zaluzhny being canned. I think it was Ray McGovern who said that that there's a palpable anger among the Ukrainians because
you can see the videos
that only the poor, the elite people, of Ukraine are not going to battle. And Scott Ritter pointed this out too, that they're sending women before they're sending able-bodied men who are from wealthy families, and that's really beginning to get under the skin of the Ukrainian people. I don't know if that's true or not. I've
seen videos currently. I mean, this is the other day that the reshuffle took place, that already there's a huge group of people on Maidan, which is Independence Square, where the whole thing happened, basically rallying against Syrskyi, and they want Zaluzhny back because they see him as the butcher. But Ian, you had some thoughts. I have some others.
Well, the average age of an American serviceman in World War II was 26. In Vietnam, that age was 19.
Holy shit.
So
Ukraine is in 40 something now,
right? And so what Carlos said about them avoiding those affluent university students is very significant. They would rather recruit 50-year-old men and people with literal mental handicaps over
that Down syndrome boy. That's horrible.
Yes, it's terrible. That poor man being thrown into that. So I think that's significant because they are avoiding, they know that's going to be, even bumping the conscription age from 27 to 25. It's not a huge bump. I mean, it's almost irrational. I mean, they should just bump it down. I mean, it's like, dude, you are at war. You want your nationhood, right? Bump it down to 18. Get everybody out there. But they can, I think that's apparent. And just the fact that this watered down bill they have now took so long to even get voted on shows that that's a political impossibility. That those people, those wealthy university age people are untouchable.
That's the thing. Goncharenko, I think, one of the Nazis in parliament, said, even if we got all the weapons, we don't have the people. I'm wondering when one day it has to come out what kind of casualties we're talking about, what that number is really going to look like. I think it's likely horrific, way above what people think.
It's horrific because it's, and I was surprised because I was when I initially looked at Ukraine's demographics, which, as we've talked about before, it's very vague because they haven't had a census in so long. But I was thinking, okay, so Ukraine could theoretically last 3 to 4 years before they're scraping the bottom of the the barrel, but they might be hitting that already. But I do think with this, I think we're at our moments like in Vietnam with 1964, the coup. It's just the USA picked a different side this time because Zelensky, because it was a power struggle between Zelensky and Zelensky.
Yeah.
And
Nuland had to fly in. Of course, there was a power struggle. Yeah.
So in this case, we looked at, the USA looked at the two sides and said, you know what, we're going to double down on Zelensky. They looked at the facts, said, we're going to tease the best guy to double down on, and Zelensky can either toe the line or he can fuck off, basically. So I think that coup moment's happened. I think it's come and gone, and that's the result. They're going to stick with Zelensky moving forward.
Yeah. I mean,
I think Ukrainians will too. Who
was backing Zelensky, and why did they prefer Zelensky over Zelensky? What did he offer? What did Zelensky offer to his backers, and why did it come to a moment where what's her name had to go over there and sort it out?
This is where we can only speculate, but I've read some places that he wanted to withdraw from places like Avdiivka, where Ukraine is clearly losing, whereas this guy Syrskyi, who's a Russian,
he's doubling down.
He's just going to follow Zelensky's orders word for word, and he is, by the way, hated by the frontline men. I mean, it's not just the West that calls him the butcher. I mean, he was the counter offensive and the failure in Bakhmut, now Artomovsk, was one of his, and they call him the butcher. A lot of the NATO accounts were very, very unhappy with Syrskyi. I mean, Plan B, we can again speculate who picked who, but Plan B was the Budanov, the military intelligence guy, right? So that would have looked like, maybe going to Lvov, maybe doing this sort of terrorist activity instead of outright war, because he's not a commander, but instead Syrskyi was put in, basically the I'll follow Zelensky's order guys. London doesn't look very happy with this, but the US does. So I think they wanted to save Zelensky, as Ian said. That's true. As for the longevity of this project, I'm really not sure. It's not looking good.
I argue with a lot of Ukrainians online, English-speaking Ukrainians, and I know that's cherry-picked because, the majority of people don't speak English on the internet. So I understand I'm talking to a very small segment of Ukrainian society, but my opinion is that they are going to stick with that. We've had this fork. We had this fork in the road, Zelensky or Zelensky. And so the powers that be went
save Zelensky.
So even the Ukrainians that think Zelensky is a moron. And actually, did you see, Ben or Billy or Carla, did you see that Ukrainian document that was basically accusing Zelensky of his insubordination and listed all of the nicknames?
I saw the nicknames. Yes,
sir. Frodo. They were very funny, actually. You could just he thinks Zelensky's an idiot. But basically, I think patriotic Ukrainians are going to say, okay, that's what happened. I don't like Zelensky, but he's the guy in charge, so we're going to go with him. So I think, for the most part, moving forward, they're going to accept that. Just like in the USA or any other country, we got this president who's an idiot. We know he's an idiot, but we've got this existential enemy. We have to rally around the flag.
Yeah, it makes sense that they would choose Zelensky over Zelensky. He's the president, and so it fits with their.
And just remember, he's built up to be the Napoleon, the Churchill. They have a lot riding on him because they built up his image from a pianist actor, to this historic guy.
And if we look at American similarities between what's happening in Ukraine now and in American history, it's something similar to Douglas MacArthur and Truman, actually.
Yep.
Because at the time of the Korean War, MacArthur was fancying himself as a presidential candidate. And even before the Korean War, MacArthur, who's that famous, for viewers who don't know, he was a very famous American general who fought in the Pacific Theater against Imperial Japan. And even in World War II, he had his share of controversy, much like what's his name again? Syrskyi. Syrskyi. He had his share. His soldiers called him Dugout Joe because he was very famous for hiding from enemy fire.
Ah,
It's not a complimentary name when your soldiers called the General Dugout Joe because he would hide from Japanese attacks. So even before the Korean War, of course, he eventually got so much controversy, mainly from losing to the Chinese attack. That's what sunk him. But even up to that point, there was controversy. So there's a lot. So my point is, there is a lot of, if you don't straight up fuck up too bad, to the point it's very obvious that you can't redeem yourself, but there's a lot that your own people, your own patriotic people will tolerate from someone before they just outright
revolt.
Revolt. Yes, that's my main point. So I just advise people not get too excited about this. If that
true
makes
enough.
sense.
A bit of caution is in order.
Yes.
Well, we can also watch further events from the angle of Zaluzhny was maybe going to withdraw to more defensible territory, whereas Syrskyi maybe won't. And so we can watch that angle as it unfolds and see if there's any truth to that.
Zelensky is all about winning the TikTok war.
It's
and
the PR. He is addicted to the camera.
Doesn't want to lose in Avdiivka. Doesn't want to lose in Bakhmut, right? That's what you're saying?
Because if you want to win a real war, sometimes you lose the battle to win the war. You give up territory. And actually, this is Mao. Mao, I don't remember the exact quote, but Mao said, you can lose land and you can get it back later, but you can't lose men.
That's the Russian attitude to this war. Yeah.
Yes, and Mao too, because Mao fought a civil war against a stronger opponent, and he won it by being smart.
Oh, by the way, I read an article somewhere in the British press about Syrskyi, and they don't mention Bakhmut, meat grinder, or anything. What they mention under his belt is the so-called big offensive around Kharkiv. Kharkiv. Yeah, I mean, which was basically an organized retreat by Russia. That's what they give him,
And I don't think that was particularly bloodless for Ukrainians too. That was advancing. It was a successful offensive, but it was with losses. For sure.
Oh yeah, there were stay-behind forces just to slow the offensive, but it was an organized retreat. Yeah.
Plus, they took heavy losses from artillery fire.
Well, just the fact that that Ukraine heavily, and people tried to memory hold this, but I remember in 2022, the 1 million man army.
Oh yeah,
that's what everybody's saying. The 1 million man army. There's no reason they did not reach that goal. They had 1 million. I think we can safely assume at the end of 2022, beginning of 2023, they had the 1 million man army that they had tried to raise, and here we are now with at best 600,000, maybe as low as 500,000. Well, what happened to the other half? Where did they go?
Well, you can always find the harrowing images of the cemeteries with the amounts of flags that are just expanding. I mean, it's absolutely tragic. And I wonder about the true scale. We'll know, I think, one day.
So globalism, I'm changing the subject. And so we've gone an hour and a half, but we broached the topic earlier, and I don't think we did it any kind of justice at all, because there's different ideas of what globalism is, who's a globalist, who's not a globalist, and especially on the right wing, libertarians and things like that, they have a certain conception of the globalists, and we oppose any kind of international organization that's going to encroach on our national sovereignty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been a long boogeyman on the right, the globalism. But I think, you can't talk about globalism and detach it from, existing reality. So the existing reality was that the West had an organization and a structure, and they invited the Soviet Union to participate in it. They said, hey, come and join us. We'll stop being enemies. Join our free markets. Join our prosperity for everyone. And there's no need to continue this, animosity towards each other. And it was a lie, right? It was a total lie. It was a ruse. It was a strategy to defeat them and to conquer them. And so, Yeltsin wasn't smart enough to figure that out. Gorbachev wasn't smart enough to figure that out. Putin is gradually, it took him a little while to figure that out. of course, the globalism that was offered wasn't a bad globalism. The globalism that was on the table ostensibly from the West to Russia was peace through mutual prosperity. It's actually what China is offering the world now.
Yes,
Peace
thank
through
you.
mutual prosperity. So, is Putin a globalist? Sure. But is Xi a globalist? Sure. But it's the good kind of globalism as opposed to the actual existing globalism of the West, where it's just imperialism and its domination over the world's resources and markets by Western oligarchs. So it's two different kinds of globalism. So it's a reality is complicated, and it stresses me out when we don't unpack it and we just give a little we don't do it justice. So I think there's a lot to discuss with the globalist agenda or
I
the
think
globalist topic.
I think that's a fair point, and I wanted to interrupt you earlier when you said the right wing and libertarians. I think you pretty much just mean Western Europe and the US, because I don't think there's a libertarian ticket in Russia, especially not in China. But those people, they hate the UN as much as they hate the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab's little club. But absolutely allergic to
so the Rush Limbaugh listeners, they were always worried about the black helicopters, the globalists, the UN,
Davos.
Davos, that's the West.
And there's legitimate, criticisms of globalism and globalists, and then there's moronic criticisms that really exist to maintain U.S. domination over these agencies. These
agreed. What I wanted to say again, it differs from where you are. In Hungary, basically, we call Brussels the globalists. Let's talk about, like, in Germany, they did this harakiri of the green agenda, which is like 180 degrees different from what you call ecological society in China. It's just a sane, rational thing done by engineers, by planners, as opposed to fanaticism that you get, which is self-destruction of the energy supply of Germany. Exactly the same goes for globalism, because the promise was, and I love that Russians call it, that we sold out the revolution for plastic bags and Coca-Cola. That's the slogan for the horrific 1990s. And what was offered is what China is doing through win-win cooperation. Like maybe I forget which Latin American country recently got funding to have their very own zinc plant, as in refined zinc, value-added product, not just grabbing up the raw resources as America has done throughout.
Was that Bolivia, maybe? I was in your...
Perhaps somewhere in Latin America. Yeah, I forgot. I'm not going to look at the cheat sheet now. But yeah, that's what China's offering. Maybe Africa should actually do the whole, not just the raw coffee, but actually do the packaging, the branding, all of that there, and get a huge share of the profits, localized. I mean, I think maybe not this interview. Putin mentioned that the population growth in Africa is not the enemy. That's the preferred outcome. We should raise those living standards so they can be like us, like Greta Thunberg's parents. I think maybe that was Lavrov saying there's a lot of poor people in Africa who would like to have a childhood like yours, Greta. It's very different from place to place. Yeah, globalism was, look, you can have Greek cheese in the supermarket and an American car. That was, the supposed thing. And underneath this visage was the robbing of the global South. And that's what's coming to an end. And maybe that's what, maybe it's a misnomer to call it globalism, but that's win-win cooperation.
What do you think, Ian? Can you agree with us?
Yes, I think that's, well, and it's not new either. Even if you look at the Soviet Union, they were very big. I would almost say Russians have a bit of a little bit, it's just Russian culture, a little bit of a savior.
Yeah, they were the anti-colonial engine.
Yes, yeah. And so even in the Soviet era, they were like that. And so in this time around, when China is doing more investment in these regions, so I can see that and I see this concern in Russia among Russians too, as long as it doesn't become a bridge too far and they over-invest, which is part of what happened to the Soviet Union. They were
in Afghanistan, for example.
Afghanistan to an extent, but they were investing a lot into Africa, and within the Soviet Union itself, like per capita, they were spending almost twice per person in the Baltic states than they were in Russia itself.
And Budapest,
Yeah.
by the way.
Yes.
They kept our living standards higher than Moscow for 40 years.
Through the Warsaw. And it's so fun. It's interesting you say that because the polls on social media are always talking. Like I even saw a poll who said
Those
this
are crazy. I have to say, it's mad.
Well, they're like, oh, well,
Within the Islamic family, they are the maddest. Go ahead. Sorry.
And they were like, oh, we had a chocolate factory, and the Russians would take all the chocolate back to Moscow. You know, we didn't get any. It's just like they're.
That's
just
the
like,
opposite of imperialism.
You know, it's just like, yeah, but yeah,
I think
I agree.
Lavrov or Putin said it somewhere earlier. I can't remember that there's this huge wellspring of goodwill built by the Soviet Union in Africa. And they still like instantly remembered at the beginning of the SMO who their friends are. And that's why they're helping kicking out the French, you know, from the Sahel region, which is going splendidly because they still remembered the Soviet legacy. And it's been good for Russia's image around the world.
Guys,
concluding thoughts, Pat?
An hour and 40 minutes in. It's been a great program.
The longest one, perhaps.
Moscow has always had several chocolate factories. You know who else had chocolate factories? Poroshenko. He was the chocolate king
Yes.
of Ukraine.
Of Ukraine, yeah.
But,
Well, it's only because Poland invented chocolate.
Yeah.
So
okay.
Yes.
Last thoughts, anyone, before I say goodbye, and we'll be back next week.
I say my apologies to the Polish people because they're crazy, but we love them. We always were like fraternal people, the Polish and the Hungarians. We all have like Borat friend relations. But yeah, guys, your leadership sometimes can go absolutely crazy. I'll end with that.
I think there's probably some good Russian-loving Poles. Maybe not a majority, but I am sure they exist.
I'm sure too.
Yeah.
I know a few. Yeah.
Carlo, thank you so much for joining us. We're glad to have you back. We didn't get to talk too much yesterday's show about your return, but it's great to have you.
Thanks.
Oh, we did, because you were on Area 51 undercover. No, I remember.
That's right. I was taken up by aliens, and
Abducted.
they
Area
probed,
51.
they probed me.
Probed you and forced you on a steady diet of Fox News and CNN.
Yes, it was torture. As Billy Bob pointed out, that's the way they tortured me. Yeah,
That
went sideways really quick. It's great having you back, Ian. Thank you again for joining us. You are almost a regular, pretty much every week, and I really appreciate you're agreeing to come on with us so regularly. Ben, thank you again.
Thanks, everyone. One last thought. Enjoy
ahead,
Ian, the Chinese New Year, which from what I can tell is the first time celebrated in Moscow. It's dressed in red. And I saw a few hours ago, Maria Zakharova speak in perfect Mandarin to celebrate it. So
yes, she did study Mandarin in university. And
that's
she was
going to drive
enjoy the
Tucker
festivities.
Carlson
Yes.
crazy. Tucker Carlson's not going to be happy with that.
All
Okay,
right.
thank you.
Take care.
We'll see you next week.